Begin lobbying and to get better access to the resources. And I think that in particular, the part about criticizing Guatemala and seeking to isolate them is relevant here to what's happening in Venezuela current day. I think that a lot of the time it's hard to contextualize what's going on right now in Venezuela with what's happened in the past in South America. And when you really look at it, it's the same as it's always been. It's the same strategy, you know? So we need to be mindful of that when we talk about it. So while the call for an implementation of sanctions usually happens under the guise of moral and noble causes, sanctions operate as a tool of imperialism to cripple the target's economies. With what's happened in the past in South America, and sanctions in Chile were to make the economy scream. Sanctions are also usually imposed upon countries where states from the global north are unsuccessful or have minimal success in controlling governments and economies. Through what it dubs friendly relations. From 1980 to 1990, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Nicaragua to make the economy scream following the successful elections of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, and their win ousted a ruler friendly to U.S. corporate interests, Somoza. Initially, the Carter government stated that it would try to upkeep friendly relations with this new Marxist party in power, but soon cut off aid and imposed sanctions, following the tendency of the Sandinista government to support other revolutionary governments in the region. The amount of devastation caused by the sanctions in Nicaragua cannot be understated, as Somoza had left the country riddled with $1.6 billion in foreign debt, $760 million of it owed to private banks. The aim of U.S.-imposed sanctions has been to put people within the sanctioned countries in desperate situations, which should cause the people within the country to revolt against their incumbent government that the U.S. deems unfriendly, or so it goes. In a study produced by Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs in 2019, they found that Venezuela, as a result of sanctions, experienced 40,000 more deaths from 2017 to 2018, as well as 300,000 people put at risk due to a lack of access to medicine and health care, compared to before the sanctioned countries in desperate situations, which should cause the people with Venezuelan economy is also said to have lost $6 billion in revenue due to sanctions, and that number is only expected to increase. And this is oil revenue, which is all used to finance social programs, you know? This is the money that's used to import food and medicine. The total amount of revenue taken away from the Venezuelan economy due to sanctions are 3 times more than what Venezuela paid for its medicine and food imports in 2018. Sachs and Weisbrot's study confirmed what many people have known for a long time, which is that sanctions are violent and they don't work. In fact, in a study, they found that 88% of sanctions had a failure rate, which means that out of all the times that they put sanctions on a country, it only worked 88. It only worked 12% of the time. Would you guys believe I'm a math tutor? So even in spite of the evidence that exists against sanctions due to their ineffectiveness and the human suffering brought about that because of them, the U.S. empire continues to rely on them as an essential tool for its imperial foreign policy. Utilized as a foreign policy tool, the use of sanctions is indiscriminately used by the 2 dominant political parties as the precursor for regime change and/or violent military intervention. We witnessed U.S. sanctions and aggressive imperialism under Obama in Libya and throughout the Middle East, and are now witnessing the same types of violent aggression under Trump. I can't make this point enough. This is a problem with both parties, and more than a problem with parties, it's a problem of financial interest. And as long as that financial interest is there, it doesn't really matter what party it is, as long as they're willing to bend to the capitalists. And we're now witnessing the same types of violent aggression. In an administration filled with neocons like John Bolton, who refer to countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua as the troika of tyranny, and Elliot Abrams, a war criminal and a perpetrator of genocide, the U.S. U.S. imperial continuity and failed sanctions, which harm people in the countries that it attempts to conduct regime change or impose sanctions on, do not work. We've already witnessed that failure does not hinder U.S. imperialism, and worse, that the U.S. is not afraid to break international law in order to get its preferences enacted globally. For example, the break from the Iran deal by Trump is an illegal move. The U.S. is now closer to another war in the Middle East, and additional attempts at regime change
burning question. It has to be burning question. If not, we leave it at the end. Burning question? Burning question? Burning question. Yadira Escobar, Cuban American. My wife called her a Cuban national treasure.
It's a lot of pressure to live up to that.
It's a challenge.
Yes, can't fall short of that. Oh boy. You said your name is Danny?
Danny.
Oh, Danny. I'm really glad that Danny was mentioning so much of the sanctions, because one of the things that I can't stand is when people get used to something, even if it's atrocious. Let me bear that in mind the time, because I'm not the time. Dictatorship of time. But that one of the things that I can't stand is when people get numb to injustice. When it's like, well, what does it matter if there are millions of people dying in Yemen? It's like you want to just shake them up and just say, it doesn't matter. You've been hearing this for over half a century. The embargo is real. It's so real. It's still there. It's so real and perhaps even effective. I'd say it's had a lot of effect. That's why it's still in place. You can't tell me that, oh, the embargo is nothing. Socialism doesn't work by itself. Then why are they still using those techniques? Why are they still in place? Why are they using it against Venezuela? Apparently the economy is just like, it's dropped like 50%. Why? Because it works. And I can't get enough of that, that phrase that basically just sums it up. Which was described by, I'm sure all Cubans here know what I'm going to read. Lester D. Mallory, deputy, if y'all could see my notes, I just drew on it. So at least it's better than last time, which I just came with 9 papers and it was a mess and I couldn't read anything. But, okay, the purpose of the embargo was described by Lester D. Mallory, deputy undersecretary of State for Inter-American Affairs on April 6, 1960. Not even my dad had been born by then, because that's what's horrific about the embargo. These sanctions are so terrible that you can have a child, small little kid in Cuba, and not his parent, but his grandfather was In fact, not even the exiled Cubans in Miami can let go of Castro. You still hear on the AM radio, they're talking about, because Fidel did this, and even the host, they have to say, Fidel's dead. Can you just drop the guy already? Because the revolution was more than just one man. It's the ideas, and Fidel knew about it too. So he says, most Cubans support Castro. There's no effective political opposition. They've always known that the opposition is a sham. And of course, I don't mean natural people that have a problem with the system. My own family had problems. That's why I'm here. That's why, we are here in Miami. A lot of us Cubans, not just for economic reasons. Some of us did have problems. We clash with that heavy. Those are the problems that Venezuela also has, where they're not revolutionary. Deep inside their homes, they're still dragging on the same problems from the Batista era. But he said that, yes, the opposition was a sham, and the only foreseeable means to alienate international support is by creating disillusionment and discouragement based on lack of satisfaction and economical difficulties. We should immediately use any possible measure to cause hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. And the hunger, there is no real hunger in Cuba, but there is monotony. Okay, you're gonna just have rice, you're gonna have some beans, you're gonna have some whatever grew in your very fertile land. So there was this study done by the UN that basically they found out that it was like 37, what was the percentage? Again, I don't know why I write these notes if later I can't even read them all. Okay, so the UN, they did a study and they found out that under the age of 3, there was a small percentage of children in Cuba in 2009. The economy was good back then because back then they were still connected to Venezuela and everything was good. I mean, I went to Cuba in 2008. My uncle said, look at this, I got a tank full of rice. I don't need anything. Obviously the things have been reduced. I mean, that's one of the reasons. That's like my motivation right now to just speak out against these sanctions, even if half of the people watching the live stream will say, what sanctions? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the very real possibility of the special period returning to Cuba. And back in like 1992, 1993, I only lived 6 years in Cuba, but I remember it very well, how people that were so respectable degraded themselves. They just sunk to these incredible levels. People died. At the end, it's not just because Bolton, he says, international law, what is that? So according to Bolton, it's like the Pirates of the Caribbean thing. They're more like guidelines. We don't need to respect them. Well, it's so easy to dictate these horrible policies to bring about a regime change that will supposedly benefit American interests. I say there are many ways to respect honor American interests, and that is definitely not the way. But we'll get to that. There are many reasons. But when you consider that in the 90s, where America had such a booming economy, credits were so easy to attain. The 90s were so good in America. The colors, because when the switch from those two parallel worlds of Cuba's dire situation because the Soviet Union had collapsed and Cuba had lost most of its markets, the subsidies, everything disappeared overnight. And in Camagüey, the province where I was born, people that were used to eating beef at least once a week suddenly had no source of protein. And people died, people went blind, and nobody cared. And it's an embarrassment that we later on, you'll see that there are millions of dollars of federal money, our taxes, used to support democracy because they hide a law. There are many reasons for punishing Cuba. The reasons they change every decade or so. Who knows what they'll be saying next year? But it was just such a contrast to have the economy, the world's biggest war machinery, just the number one giant, sanction such a small island that will not be coerced, that will not be pushed into submission. They would rather suffer it the way they've been suffering for 60 years than to just bend down and lick some Yankee boot. It's not going to happen. That's why, not at all. That's why Cuba recently passed a law they call the late 1880, a law of reaffirmation of dignity and sovereignty meant to protect the economy, meaning that if anybody tries to give off information to the American government that will, again, worsen the economy, they know that that's a traitor to the Cuban nation. Why? Because that means that children will not have access to medicine, children will not have access to a whole bunch of vitamins that here we have, cornflakes, they add vitamin D. We've got a surplus of vitamins here. People don't even want to fry their eggs now in these iron skillets because they're like, no more iron. But children have deficiencies, in Cuba. Why? Because the embargo is real and these sanctions are meant to just crush people's spirit, and it doesn't work. My Cuban side knows this, and I'm just sometimes shocked when I read in English. I'm in America, and I'm reading what some of these programs for subversion are planning to do in Cuba, and then like my Cuban just wakes up and says, "What the hell? No. I know my people. They're not going to tolerate this because it's degrading. When you see these right-wing Republicans, they talk about, freedom of markets. Well, how come I can't do business with Cuba? Will you just let me be a free American citizen and do business with whoever the heck I want? Why can't I travel to Cuba freely? If I didn't have my two grandmothers over there that tell me basically what's going on. And at the end of the day, when you analyze the reasons, supposedly, the reasons that they have these crippling sanctions on Cuba, sanctions that were just tightened once Cuba lost the Soviet Union, because it's like what they did to North Korea. North Korea had a drought a couple years ago, sanctions. It's like, okay, so I'm dying, you just want to kick me in the rear, and so just to make things worse, right? I'm sorry, but according to what these right-wing Republican people say, especially around the holiday times, which Merry Christmas, and they just give each other cards and all that. Well, you do know that's your brethren, right? They're like 90 miles, because in Latin, basically the origin of prójimos was like proximus. It's basically anybody that was close to you. So if you want to be this hyper-nationalistic, cozy Christian with nice conservative values, don't you think you should be trying to make friends with your Cuban neighbors? They're right there. There are kids there that are growing up knowing that you, who are so fat with prosperity, just want them to starve. Why? Because you don't like the unique economic and political system that they have. A model which I am sick and tired of hearing, that is just an experiment. Guess what? All human endeavor is an experiment. This university, be it socialism or capitalism or a religious community, everything is an experiment, and I'm more than happy to welcome experiments because life is constantly changing. So why would you want to be stuck in the cave, as a Neanderthal? Oh no, I don't want to try no experiments. We need to experiment things. That's what's good about the Cuban Revolution, that is constantly changing. But those changes, those reforms, guess what? Embargo, they're all economic reforms, because supposedly the push, the coercion, the methods of asphyxiating the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban people, let's be honest, the Cuban people, these sanctions are meant to do a regime change and basically change the political system. Oh, one party system, that's horrific. We need, you guys need two, like us, you guys need two parties so that you can switch around the power between the two. But the Cuban model, since the sanctions cripple the economy, what are they doing? They're doing economic reforms. That's why the other day they recently added to their list of allowable things. Now people can have cyber cafes, these internet cafes. They can have internet, sure, even though most of the internet in the Cuban blogosphere, all of that is just saturated with fake entities. They're just, they're journalists, but, it's like Radio Marti people. They're not journalists. These people are paid to basically just find whatever they find on the internet and justify. If you listen to what these Cuban journalists on the outside of Cuba are saying, the depths to which they will sink, they talk about embarrassing things that I would not even mention here because it's indecent. How they take pictures of little girls in the Malagon, they say prostitutes. Really? That does not sound like a political speech. You're not trying to change the economic model. What you're trying to do is degrade the national spirit. You want Cubans to be embarrassed that they can't afford toilet paper. It's like what they did to Venezuela. Toilet paper. Do you really think humans can just value as the ultimate prize of possession just toilet paper? Like, really? And when you hear these people, these so-called journalists, talk about Cuba, you see that all that they do is just trying to degrade the national spirit, just degrade them completely, so that then the Cubans, they would say, well, I'm going to gladly give up this garbage of a country. But it's not true, because Cuba is like one of the last possible chances that people have of experimenting. One of the last places where you don't have these multinationals dictating policy, but, because they're basically like the new gods of our time. They can just run through these national boundaries and do anything that they want. But essentially, what's really grotesque about how everything has been tightening, how everything has just, the situation with Cuba is worsening, is how I feel that we're losing what we acquired after World War II. Because after World War II, in 1941, the Atlantic Charter set out 8 goals. And I want to read just 4 of them because it's incredible how it's like we're dumb and we just can't, we don't learn from our mistakes, and then we try to just repeat the same mistakes. Because one of the 4 things of just absolute stupidity that we have lost is, 1, they knew in 1941 that all people had the right to self-determination. It's like common sense. It's simple. It's liberty. You want to preach liberty? How about letting the Cubans decide what kind of government they want? Then later on we could talk about whether it's right or wrong, because that's also something that I can't stand, is how whenever you want to talk about Cuba, you have to earn the right to defend something that you like. You have to legitimize your voice, and you have to do some criticism. You have to criticize. You have to say, oh, well, but the regime doesn't allow this. Now can I say that kids kind of have free education? You have to earn the right to speak, and that's just horrific. But anyways, the Atlantic Charter said all people have the right to self-determination, global economic cooperation, and advancement on social welfare, because yes, not everybody is a 20-year-old super healthy buff Trump supporter who can, just go to work and everything's all right. You have disabled people, you have sick people, you have elderly people. There are just so many parts of society that will not fit that kind of ubermensch soldier thing that will just push the economy forward, that of course you need to have some sort of safety net to watch out for people, because we're not going to be the Greeks, we're not going to have disabled children, put them out in the mountains so the wolves take care of that, because that just leads again to fascism. And they also knew that all the participants of the Atlantic Charter would try to create a world that was free of want and free of fear, but also, especially this one, I'm absolutely amazed, freedom of the seas. So that means that Rick Scott should not be proposing a naval blockade against Cuba. It's like, Rick Scott, did you not know that in 1941, we kind of already figured out that you don't do this in the high waters? You need to have freedom of movement. You need to have cooperation. And also, the embargo cannot be punishing other countries. China cannot be punished because the current administration decided that now we're going to punish Cuba because of some supposed stronghold that they have in Venezuela, which I have to add that it is absolutely ridiculous when you hear the story that Iran, Russia, and Cuba 3 separate countries, 3 different nations, 3 different languages, and they say that these 3 different nations are controlling Venezuela. You know, as if Venezuela was, you know. It's like, think about it. Can Russia and Cuba work at the same time to control a country? It doesn't, like in colonial times, that has never happened. Never have you had superpowers deal with a lesser country like that. And then, of course, let's remember, where's Venezuela in all of this, right? They just want any nation to step all over them, right? But again, I don't know how much time I have left, but to sum it up, basically, yes, I think that the embargo, not only is it immoral and just harms us, but if you look at the sanctions imposed against Cuba from a very selfish, pragmatic point of view, it also harms us. It harms our local economy. Because every year we lose, I will find it. Okay, first, the United States loses around $1,000 million to $3,000 million a year. So it's costing us. We're losing money. You know how many farmers just want to do business with Cuba? But wasn't that like what the essence of a free market is all about? Shouldn't people have the right to be adventurous and go do business with whoever they want? Oh no, you can't do that. It's forbidden. Why? Because they preach one thing, but then they do another. And of course, not to mention that the embargo itself has cost Cuba thousands of millions of dollars, but again, it doesn't matter. You know? I mean, the Guantanamo Bay, the military base, for instance, we're not paying the Cubans for that. So what are they doing there, right? I mean, we could discuss whether or not they belong there or not, but they're not paying. And the last time I checked, in America, if you don't pay for a house, you're getting foreclosured. All right, so you have to pay for that place. You can't just stay there and say, well, I can do this because it's a dictatorship and all that. But when they're constantly living in denial, when our administrations live in denial, who does that harm? Not just the Cubans, it also harms us. Because if the government in the 60s had not been wasting its time in denial, thinking that with the Bay of Pigs, that they were going to just get rid of that pesky problem that they had in Cuba, because they were so sure that the Soviet Union would last forever, and that with Cuba, let's just invade them, we'll get rid of that little pimple, that problem, we'll get rid of that real quick. And had they not been wasting time with that, they would have sat down and negotiated all the nationalizations that took place, just like other countries did. Other more respectable and responsible countries actually tried to negotiate, and the people received, all these companies received their rightful compensation. But except the United States, and I think there was one particular British corporation that also did not receive that. But had they sat down and negotiated, had they actually had some dialogue with the revolutionary people that in that time had full support of the people, all this would have been paid off by the 80s, and we wouldn't have this problem. We wouldn't have another excuse to sanction the Cubans, because of the properties, but you didn't really care about the properties back then. Okay, human rights, you don't really care about the violation of human rights, because the programs that you do, most of the money just stays here in Miami with corrupt politicians, all right? Most of the money does not even go to Cuba. It just crumbs, that's what reaches Cuba. But again, so I don't take up any more of your time because Max is going to talk to you about Venezuela now. Again, I didn't really read much, but you go basically going to have a basic idea of what I'm trying to defend here, which is, of course, the Cuban people, who are the only ones that at the end of the day are suffering these sanctions. So thank you so much.
Before we go into the burning questions, wasn't my wife right?
Yeah.
The other thing is what you see her saying here. She's not just saying it to us here. She
but the quote is, criticizes me for having a one-party system, but they have a one-party system too. But in typical American extravagance, they have two of them because it's just capitalist.
And now, Max, there is no question for you.
No questions, no questions.
Any questions?
No, that would be an excuse to keep me talking.
All right. Max Blumenthal, who one of the most important things that I think we need to keep in mind is that after his trip to Venezuela, he went to Geneva and spoke at the UN Human Rights Council about what he saw in Venezuela. He's we are privileged to have him come to South Florida and speak to us. It's a great honor to have you here, Max, and welcome. I hope you'll be getting a Miami sunshine welcome. So
thank you. And Anya Parampil was also in Geneva, and she got, I think, twice as many views on YouTube as me. So, and that was a really hard act to follow. I kind of was like demoralized. I don't know if I have that much charisma. This is my second time at FIU, believe it or not. You remember I was here, and the last time I was here, I spoke about Palestine, and what we're talking about in a lot of ways when we talk about sanctions is the Gazification of the world, the global Gaza. I mean, Gaza is the ultimate sanctions case, and you should, if you want to see up close in a very intimate, on-the-ground way what sanctions have done to the people of Gaza and what they're aiming to do to Cuba, to Venezuela, to Iran. Watch my film with Dan Cohen. We shot it over the course of several years. It's called Killing Gaza. It's about the systematic destruction of a society by Israel and its backers. And you can watch it at killinggaza.com. You can rent it for $3. And I always say that's about less expensive than a half-cap double frap macchiato latte red eye with a splash of chai. So check it out. I think that's a really important document that's relevant. Palestine helped me see that Israel was not uniquely evil, but that it was, in fact, the most extreme reflection of ourselves in the West and what we are becoming as our empire starts to fray at the edges. Palestine helped me develop a sharper understanding of the world as a whole and of my own society. Also spending time in Israel, which I wrote about in my second book, Goliath. If you really want to understand a society that's permanently at war, that's a permanent occupier, and what it does to the people in that society, especially the young people, because all young people in Israel, whether they're male or female, trans, whatever they are, they have to be conscripted into the military. And if you don't want to go into combat, they'll find something for you. You can be a drone jockey. They have an all-female unit that operates a remote control machine gun from the Negev desert that is perched atop the walls that hold in the population of the Gaza Strip. And they shoot people from miles away just by joystick. So what does that do to a society? It makes it permanently right-wing. It makes it fascistic. And that's the society you're growing up in increasingly here, I find. I was at FIU the last time I was here to talk about Palestine. My host left me in the freshman dorms. I was like 37, and I'm 41 now. And so I'm sitting there in the freshman dorms, and I'm like, all right, I have nowhere to stay, and I'm an old man in the freshman dorms. I wind up doing drinking games, and it seems like this event is much better planned, and I won't wind up there. And I've come back. Yeah, there were some decent, there are cool people here. I mean, we didn't talk politics. I'm glad we didn't. It's like come back to find that your campus magazine really sucks. I mean, I watched this event. Actually, we were in Venezuela watching it, and it says that the message resonated with the 1,500 strong audience at the Convocation Center and gave hope to the assembled immigrants and their adult children who were wearing white supremacist MAGA hats. No, it actually didn't say that. But I didn't note that there was a huge protest here, right, Pete? Those people are invisible. This is basically, just pure propaganda. It doesn't mention that Oscar Perez and his mother, the mother of a literal terrorist who bombed the Justice Ministry from a helicopter in Caracas, was brought on stage as a national hero. This is the narrative you're supposed to believe. This is the narrative that's being rammed down your throat. And it's the narrative that's accepted, of course, by all the Republicans who serve this great state. Marco Rubio, a wonderful character who has promised that Venezuela will, from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that Venezuela will suffer unlike any nation in modern history. You got Rick Scott, who was talked about before. I learned last night that he actually broke the law in the Navy and was selling soda cans at sea, which you're not allowed to do. So he, only breaks a blockade when it profits himself. And then who else do you have? Rick DeSantis. I said last night that Ron, whatever. Ron. Right? Ron's better. Ron sounds more like an insurance agent. No offense to anyone named Ron. But, he's over in Israel right now. He's in an illegal settlement. He was at an illegal settlement yesterday getting an award. And when he comes back, he basically wants to make it illegal for me to advocate for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And therefore, it would effectively declare me a Jew who had a bris and a bar mitzvah, and getting a bris isn't easy if you know what that is. It's not fun. It remarks you for the rest of your life. It's unforgettable. Ron DeSantis didn't have one. Basically declare me an anti-Semite. They're going to declare BDS a form of hate speech and therefore legislate away on a state level the First Amendment and make it essentially illegal in so many ways for you to exercise your constitutional rights. So what's going on here with this kind of like naked propaganda, these laws, the sanctions, it's a desperation. It's imperial desperation. And it shows that we're actually having an effect, but it's doing a lot of damage to your generation. There's only one, and I look at the presidential campaigns often, even though you can just like dismiss it all as like a kind of two parties that are essentially capitalists that are the same. But I look at them as barometer on where we are. There is one candidate who stands out from all the others because that candidate uses a word that no other candidate will use in this era, in this generation. And it is, I think, the youngest candidate, someone who's younger than I am. And what is that word? The word is peace. Only one candidate is campaigning on a peace platform in this presidential race. It's Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
And this is probably one of the only rooms that you'll hear her applauded in Florida. And that's because she is the target of a massive disinformation campaign being waged by corporate media and the war state. But what does it say when there's one candidate and only one candidate who will campaign on peace and who's basically not even polling at 2% because they're being ignored? It means that so many people in this society, especially young people, don't even consider the possibility of living in peace. They've accepted permanent war as the status quo. And that's really the function of a generation that's grown up after 9/11, since 9/11, since the AUMF was the authorization for the use of military force was passed by Congress, which basically allows the president to circumvent Congress and declare war whenever he or she wants. And efforts to sunset the AUMF have been shot down time after time after time. Lindsey Graham, the most warlike member of the Senate, constantly says, why do we need to vote on a war? It's like, what do you exist for? Oh yeah, you exist to get money from Lockheed Martin, that's why you're there. So, I grew up in a sort of different time. You talked about, I think both of the previous speakers talked about, kind of alluded to the 1990s. And what a different time it was. From the Cuban perspective, it was a very dark time. And I actually was in Cuba during the special period in 2001, and I did see the desperation. And as a tourist, my color was green for a lot of desperate people. I wasn't just a white guy. And it was upsetting. It was genuinely upsetting. This was the state that the United States wanted countries that tried to carve out an independent path in the world to be in. And if you read media at the time, but especially in the 90s, about Cuba or about North Korea, they all expected that those governments, which they all call regimes, would fall. They were sure they would fall. There was a triumphalism in the air in the 1990s. Why? Because the Soviet Union had fallen, and the Soviet Union provided another pole of influence in the world, of international influence, to allow those independent governments to have their economy supported, also with technological help and industrial assistance. And that pole was gone. So in the United States, you not only had these books that are now mocked about what world we were to be expecting, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, who was a second-generation neoconservative, about how we were entering an era where the kind of neoliberal technocratic elite would define the consensus and would be completely unchallenged. But then you had some other documents that I write about in my latest book, which is called The Management of Savagery. And my book is really about the world that I grew up in, the politics I grew up in. It starts in 1979 with the biggest CIA covert operation in Afghanistan, where we being the unelected national security state under Jimmy Carter, armed the Mujahideen. It also was when the U.S. began to turn its attention to Central America and armed death squads there. And that's 2 years after I was born, but I really focus on the 1990s to set up 9/11 and to set up the program that the U.S. national security state, this unelected, opaque element that emphasizes continuity between Republican and Democratic administrations, wanted to bring in at some point if they could. And so documents start tumbling out of think tanks in Washington, D.C., like the Clean Break document, which, if you want to understand the United States in the Middle East, including today, and if you want to understand the drive to war that John Bolton is animating, you have to understand what the Clean Break document is. It was published in 1996. One author of it was Douglas Feith. Another was Richard Pearl. These are names you might recognize, who helped found the Office of Special Plans, which stovepiped intelligence during the Iraq War to falsely claim that Saddam Hussein was connected to Al-Qaeda. Then there are lesser-known figures like David Wormser. Feel free to forget the name. The only reason you need to know it is that he's currently in John Bolton's shadow National Security Council. So he's currently actually in the Trump administration. And these are people who made this document not for the U.S. government, but for Benjamin Netanyahu, who was entering his first term as prime minister in Israel in 1996. The document called for, basically it was, here's Netanyahu's plan for the Middle East. This is what you should do for the wider region. Get the U.S. to help you take out 7 countries in 5 years, particularly Syria, which was the strategic depth of Iran and Iraq, because they all support Palestinian resistance groups inside Palestine, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon. And it also called for taking out Hezbollah. The document offers specifics. Work with Sunni Arab tribes in northeastern Syria and arm them in order to fragment the Syrian state. Now, what happened later on in northeastern Syria is something I write about in great detail in my book, which is the arming of those Sunni elements by the CIA, and I'll talk about this a little later, led to the rise of ISIS in northeastern Syria. So this was forecasted already in 1996 by these neoconservatives who were working for Benjamin Netanyahu. Then you have the Project for a New American Century. I'm going to bring Venezuela into all of this, so don't worry. But this is, I'm bookending it with my book to help you understand regime change as a wider global program. You have the Clean Break document. And then you have the Project for a New American Century. Basically, all the neoconservatives got together with a few liberals and Democrats to present a plan for what they called benevolent hegemony, where the U.S. would be a benevolent world dictator. This document was organized by two figures, Robert Kagan, who went on to advise both Mitt Romney, the Republican, and Hillary Clinton. You know, you talk about the duopoly, the foreign policy duopoly, and William Kristol, Bill Kristol, who's like the godfather of the neocons now, one of the stupidest men in Washington. But, you know, when you're stupid and you're on it ended on 9/11, and this opened up the possibility, event opened up the possibility for what not just the neoconservatives, but what a lot of Democrats wanted to do as well. Benevolent hegemony. What was the first target? Well, they went to Afghanistan, but the first real target was Iraq. It was like at the top of the clean break document. And Iraq was going to lead to Iran being taken out. We're still trying to take out Iran. Not possible. Wesley Clark, who was then the Supreme Commander of European forces in the U.S. Army, walks into the Pentagon a few days after 9/11, and he meets a general, and the general is freaked out. A lot of the generals weren't sure what was happening, and these were being, this agenda was being driven by ideological political elements, neoconservatives, including no shortage of former Trotskyists who still believed in a Trotskyist doctrine of permanent revolution, very radical elements. And the general said to Wesley Clark, I just got a document passed to me by Donald Rumsfeld that calls for regime change in 7 countries in 5 years, and I'm really disturbed. 2006 comes, and that is what Condoleezza Rice, who became the national security advisor to George W. Bush, called the birth pangs of a new Middle East. And that was the Israeli attack on southern Lebanon and southern Beirut to take out Hezbollah, per these documents, per these plans. It was a devastating assault, and Hezbollah actually dealt Israel a bloody nose and sent him packing, and the birth pangs of the Middle East turned into an episiotomy. It wasn't pretty for Israel or for the neoconservatives in Washington, but what did Condoleezza Rice mean by that? What did she mean? She meant that this was a test run, a pilot program for what the U.S. wanted to do to Iran. Iran was always the next prize, and I'm gonna talk about why Iran. Very similar to why the U.S. wants to target Venezuela. And, Danny explained this very well. They have massive amounts of oil and gas reserves. They are also an independent revolutionary country. I mean, I think their government is reactionary, but they have a revolutionary government that is independent and that wants to chart its own path and that supports Palestinian resistance. And you're wondering why I call it Iran government reaction. No, you've got to pay attention. Stay off Twitter.
It's hard.
I know, I told you I'm not as charismatic as the other speakers. So this is 2006. It's a very depressing picture that I'm painting right here. And the Bush administration, however, had gotten bogged down in the Middle East. The war in Iraq was going horribly. The U.S. was resorting to desperate strategies, including in Iraq. I write about this in my book, The Salvador Option, where a character who had helped train the death squads in El Salvador, named David Steele, had been brought to Iraq to train Shia militias and turn them into literal death squads to kill Sunnis in the Anbar province. And this was really the sign of the war taking a very disastrous turn. Bush's approval rating was down to 20%. And the Sunnis began to organize themselves in northwestern Iraq, in the Anbar province, against these death squads into what would eventually become the Islamic State. This is a horrible development, but something different was happening in the Western Hemisphere. Something hopeful, something that was totally unexpected to these elements that came out in the 1990s and thought that the U.S. was going to usher in a benevolent hegemony. And it was Chavismo. It was the rise of Hugo Chavez and what the Venezuelan people had been doing actually since the 1980s and 90s, really redefining resistance to neoliberalism and resistance to empire along the lines of what Chavez himself called 21st century socialism. And you could argue that one moment of resistance was the Caracazo in 1989, when Venezuelans rose up against this neoliberal government that had been basically signed this gigantic IMF deal and just started raising prices, raising bus fares on people, raising food prices, and they went out and rebelled, and they were killed by the hundreds and possibly by the thousands by the National Army. Chavez was a response to that moment. Chavismo was a response to that moment. And he was elected in 1998, but in 2006, I think Chavismo reaches its apotheosis, its apogee. The economy is roaring in Venezuela. PDVSA has been nationalized. Chavez goes before the United Nations General Council and he delivers a full-throated anti-imperialist denunciation of what the United States has done in Iraq and what Israel was currently doing at that moment in Lebanon. And he shakes the national security establishment in the West to its core. How dare he? Who is he? And what is he doing with this oil wealth? He wasn't just, and this is one of the biggest threats of Chavismo to the U.S. national security state, he wasn't just paying for free housing programs, free education programs, free healthcare in Venezuela. He had created ALBA and all of these, and was the center of all of these regional alliances, which were driving a progressive wave through Latin America, and which had helped take Cuba out of the special economy and into much better situation. I was in Managua, in Nicaragua, in 2006 for Daniel Ortega's inauguration, and there was so much hope in that square. And Hugo Chavez, of course, made a personal visit, quoting all of these resistance heroes, Simón Bolívar, Che Guevara, Jose Martí, so many people that everyone had studied in elementary school, but they wanted new heroes for their contemporary age. And he spoke about a 21st century socialism to all of these young Nicaraguans who hadn't experienced what their parents had with the first wave of Sandinismo, and helped inspire, along with Ortega, the second, I think, the return of a revolutionary government. The United States was unable to respond in the same way that it had in the Middle East because it was bogged down there. But there were these soft power outfits that we've talked about tonight. USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, the National Endowment for Democracy. If you want to know what the U.S. is doing in Latin America, you have to know about these organizations, because they began pumping tens of millions of dollars into Venezuela and across Latin America, into Bolivia to combat the rise of Evo Morales. In Cuba, they came up with Zunzuneo, right? Zunzuneo, which was basically like a fake Twitter, fake social media application to encourage flash mobs in order to destabilize society. They funded in Cuba Generación 2007, Generation 2007, which was the original grouping of the party that is now known as Popular Will, Voluntad Popular, in Venezuela. And basically what they did with USAID and National Endowment for Democracy money is send student leaders, so-called student leaders, like Leopoldo Lopez, who had already been, participated in one coup, and a young Juan Guaido, Carlos Vecchio, our friend who is the fake ambassador in Washington, on training missions to places like Belgrade to learn from a group called Canvas, which basically trained young people around the world for regime change operations, to basically do destabilizing series of protests and social media and media. Canvas would advise them about not just tactics, but exactly what to do and when to do it. And thanks to a journalist who is facing 120 years in prison, who is not an American, but in an American court, a journalist named Julian Assange, we know about those plans because they appeared in the Stratfor documents that are on WikiLeaks, and I'll tell you about one of them. One of them, in 2010, advised Generation 2007, Guaido, Lopez, Jan Goicoechea, who got a $500,000 award from the Koch brothers, and helped found the party Primero Justicia in Venezuela, which is very similar to Popular Will. All these cats, it advised them the water levels at the Guri Dam, which is the main hydroelectric plant that provides electricity to 85% of Venezuela, are going to go down. And this is a great moment. We should seize this moment because there may be blackouts, and blackouts will produce a possibility for the opposition that we've never had before. And of course, what happened this March after the coup began to fail? At the Gray Zone, we published this document because it provides such a clear indication that this wasn't happenstance and this was not a coincidence, but this is something that had been on the table for a long time. So I'll kind of move through what I was going to talk about so we can get more to questions. But the United States... Sorry?
Yeah. This has been awesome.
Okay, thank you.
As far as I'm concerned.
Good.
Go
So
on.
with the United States, it always, I thought before 9/11, the U.S. had not really wanted to get so bogged down in the Middle East. It hadn't wanted to be so heavily involved. The neoconservatives had for various reasons, but there wasn't a full agreement in the national security state on that. There was always a desire to prevent the rise of China, and that's where we are now. But the U.S. wound up getting more deeply involved in the Middle East because it saw more opportunities, and these soft power organizations saw the opportunities in the so-called Arab Spring. And I can admit to being very inspired by the Arab Spring. I saw these young people in the street declaring the people demand that the leader goes on into permanent exile and on vacation to Saudi Arabia, or whatever the chant was, wherever the dictators get deposed to. I was inspired by it. And then I saw something that's disturbed me and caused me to question the whole thing. And it was the body of Muammar Gaddafi rotting on a mattress in a butcher shop in Misrata while opposition supporters were taking trophy photos of themselves. And I watched the video of Gaddafi being sodomized by a bayonet and then shot in the head. And then I learned that the people who had sodomized him with a bayonet and shot him in the head were members of a group called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was a local Al-Qaeda affiliate. And I learned that group had been armed by the United States and the UK and Qatar, and that they had been provided with air cover, including by drone jockeys from Nellis Air Base in Nevada, to take out Gaddafi's motorcade. And I started on a process, a very slow process, fortunately too slow process, of unpacking what the hell was going on as the U.S. embarked on a project in the Middle East that built on Iraq, built on the disaster of Iraq, to destabilize more countries that were on the clean break and Project for a New American Century target board, and did so through unconventional warfare by arming proxies, as the U.S. did in Afghanistan, with the so-called Mujahideen freedom fighters, in tandem with our democratic freedom-fighting friends in the permanent monarchies of the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council. So from Libya, I saw a disaster unfold where we now have open-air slave camps. We now have a civil war continuing some 8 years later, massive casualties continuing, a massive refugee crisis which has helped change politics in Europe. And if you watch the EU parliamentary elections that took place last week, you can see the results of that. The far-right parties have exploited this refugee crisis the same way Donald Trump has exploited the crisis on this border, which was created by the drug war, by NAFTA, and by so many other insane policies. So Libya was sold to us the same way that Venezuela was being sold to us, on the basis of a humanitarian intervention. R2P, responsibility to protect. And if you follow the more radical parties in the Venezuelan opposition of Maria Corina Machado, for example, she is explicitly calling for R2P, for responsibility to protect. The chairman, the general secretary of the Organization of American States, the Uruguayan fanatic, who is so fanatical he was expelled from his own party in Uruguay, Luis Almagro, has explicitly called for R2P in Venezuela. And this R2P doctrine was put on display in Libya. It was under a Democratic administration with figures like Samantha Power and Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton, who claimed to care about human rights. They're not talking like Bush about the Bible and eradicating evil. They're talking about saving the children. We have a responsibility to go there and protect these people from the evil dictator. And if we do that, we'll save them. So we're going to bomb to save the people. And Libya now stands as the perfect example of what happens when R2P is deployed. So when you talk about Venezuela, keep what happened in Libya in mind, and what was one of the first things that happened after Gaddafi was murdered by Salafi jihadi U.S. proxies. The slaughter of Libya's black population, the Tawerga people, were killed in large numbers because they were seen as a population that had been treated as, like, with special favors and had been protected by Gaddafi, just as the Afro-Venezuelan population has been targeted by the followers of Leopoldo Lopez. And many of you are familiar with the burning alive of Orlando Figuera in the Altamira neighborhood in 2017. It's that same phenomenon. So when you enact R2P, the weakest are the ones who often suffer. That whole mentality is completely upside down. So then we move to Syria, and this is a situation I get into heavily in my book. We moved to Syria from Libya. Actually, if it weren't for Libya, it wouldn't have been possible to arm the so-called rebels in Syria so early and use them as proxies against Assad's government, because it was the weapons that were looted from the military depots of the military of Gaddafi that were taken on the CIA's rat line from Libya to Syria. And a Hillary Clinton advisor actually referred to it as the bank shot, using the sports metaphor. Do you remember Christopher Stevens? Do you remember Benghazi? There was a U.S. ambassador who was killed in Benghazi, and there was this huge scandal about that, and everybody kind of mocked it because it was kind of like a phony Republican scandal to embarrass Hillary Clinton. It did help cost her presidential election in many ways, because it drove public mistrust in her. But what no one talked about with Benghazi was no one interrogated in U.S. media, beyond the fact that we destroyed an entire country to protect the population, was that why was Christopher Stevens in Benghazi? The U.S. embassy was not in Benghazi. It was in Tripoli. Why was he there at the consulate, a few blocks from the CIA's station office? Because he was helping to organize, along with the head of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the transfer of weapons from Libya to Syria. And when you hear about Syria in the U.S. media, they say, all of these people just came out demonstrating peacefully and that they just wanted freedom. No, that's not exactly what happened. There were large demonstrations, and many youth did want reform. They wanted an end to the corruption they were seeing. They wanted, a lot of things that anyone would the moderate rebels. They were moderate, right? No one really knew who they were. They were just Free Syrian Army. And it basically became a weapons farm for Jabhat al-Nusra, They also took an entire province, which there's a fight for right in northwestern Syria, called the Idlib province. And they set up their own government there. And this is a model that, could be applied to Venezuela if unconventional warfare takes place. What did they do there? They embarked on a process that Professor Joshua Landis, who I think is the leading critical expert on Syria in the United States, called Talibanization. They Talibanized these areas because these were extreme Islamist militias taking over areas in a country where you have Christians, you have Shia, you have Alawites, all kinds of religious minorities, and you have a secular population. And in Idlib, you had Druze. This is another religious minority that is considered un-Islamic by these extremist militias. The Druze were forced to dig up the graves of their ancestors because they were not buried in what was considered an Islamist way. They were forced to convert or be killed. The Christians were forced to convert or be killed. Women were not even allowed to wear colorful hijab. They had to wear all black for years in Idlib. Public singing was banned. Public weddings were banned. It was a dystopia was imposed on millions of people, and Idlib province became the home of the largest franchise of Al-Qaeda, the organization responsible for 9/11, thanks to US arms, thanks to weapons from the UK and France. And now it exists under the protection of Donald Trump, the most Islamophobic president in history, someone who blamed Ilhan Omar for 9/11. Isn't that crazy? Mm-hmm. But those are the facts. And right now the Syrian government is fighting to retake Idlib from a literal Al-Qaeda affiliate that celebrates the 9/11 attacks as a response to a decadent homosexual culture in the US. And Donald Trump is saying, you can't go there, we're protecting them. Donald Trump doing that on behalf of the national security state. What took place in Venezuela, what we're seeing there, it hasn't gone to this level yet. It hasn't reached that level. Because we see the consequences of unconventional warfare in Syria and in Libya. Refugee crisis. The refugee crisis is the ultimate consequence. And Syria is the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And what my book does, what I try to do in my book, is draw a connection between the refugee crisis that was caused by intervention and the rise of the far right in the West. Because it's these far right Eurosceptic parties that are getting all the votes from a population that fears, first of all, the loss of their pensions, and also, the population is infected by xenophobic sentiments. So Venezuela hasn't gotten there, but I was worried in February when we were in Venezuela that what was taking place on the border there was a step towards capturing Venezuelan territory and maybe setting up a free Venezuelan army. Now, what took place on February 23rd was an attempt at a humanitarian intervention in Venezuela. And they were using the same rhetoric of, you have to come in, the US has to come in to save the people from this evil dictator. And they made Maduro out to be an evil dictator, even though he had won pretty much fair and square in an election in 2018, in which the three main opposition parties in Venezuela refused to participate with direction from the US, because the US wanted to delegitimize their democratic institutions so they could call Maduro a dictator. And the one major opposition leader who did participate, Henry Falcon, the US threatened to sanction. 2 weeks before that election, Canada and the US had already decided that it was an illegitimate election. So you have the dictator, you have the USAID waiting on the Colombian side of the border with a bunch of trucks trying to come in, and then you have Juan Guaido wanting to set up quote-unquote liberated territory. It seemed kind of, looking at Libya and Syria, that backdrop, very disturbing. And it failed. It failed, you explain why regime change in Cuba failed. It failed because of mass popular mobilization. It failed because some regular guys who were Venezuelan security forces were willing to stand on the border against these trucks plowing at them, and droves of what are known as guarimberos, who are basically paid violent thugs, throwing Molotov cocktails, just like hailing raining down a hail of Molotov cocktails on them, failed because those guarimberos wound up burning the aid themselves. And we at the Gray Zone were the first publication in English to reveal how that took place. Failed because nobody believed USAID Director Mark Green or Colombian President Ivan Duque or Marco Rubio, who was like up till 4 a.m. tweeting ferociously on the Colombian border. Good reminder. No one believed them that Maduro had burned that aid. No one believed them because the videos were going around. But it is worth remembering that Marco Rubio, someone who could also be known thanks to his cocaine cowboy brother-in-law Orlando Sicilia from, what is it, West Kendall? West Kenmore? West Kendall? West Kendall, yeah. As Narco Rubio. Marco Rubio actually tweeted a photo, that photo that I mentioned of Gaddafi being killed next to Nicolas Maduro, and basically drew the connection that I'm trying to draw. And so the coup continued to fail. It continued to fail in March after the hydroelectric dam went down 6 hours after Rubio promised unprecedented suffering for Venezuela. And people were forced to grapple with their electricity being out. We had an electricity outage for like 12 hours and we were freaking out. Venezuelans pooled together because they knew what was being done to them and helped each other charge their phones. They walked miles to work. The transit workers who were trying to maintain the metro system in Caracas, which by the way is free, unlike ours in Washington, D.C., and unlike yours, which doesn't exist. They became soldiers. They became soldiers in a hybrid war where the target was the basic infrastructure of the people, and they knew that they were soldiers, and they restored the metro system to full functioning within 2 or 3 days. Electricity was rationed, but they fought through that level of the crisis through mass popular mobilization. If Maduro was really an unpopular dictator, it wouldn't have worked out that way. And then came the final blow on April 30th, when Leopoldo Lopez emerges from his hole in house arrest and declares that the coup is beginning with Juan Guaido, who I don't know how he's still allowed to ride around in his motorcycle, a free man, but that's what's happening in this terrible dictatorship. But they tried to mobilize basically a platoon of soldiers with blue bands on their sleeves, just shooting wildly around the La Carlota air base in an opposition-heavy neighborhood in Caracas. And what happens on the other side of town in front of Miraflores Palace is hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans come out to defend the palace against the coup. And the coup is pretty much finished by the end of the day. And by like 8:30 p.m., Tucker Carlson is hosting an anti-imperialist, anti-coup rant by Anya Parampil. And that's how you know the whole thing had completely failed. And now we're in a situation now where you have a Libyan crisis, but you have Syria coming back together, having defeated an unconventional warfare because it called on its allies in Iran, in the organization of Hezbollah, and in Russia, and because massive amounts of people mobilized. Over 100,000 people on the government side lost their lives in Syria to fight against this ruthless proxy war, and they have stopped it in its tracks. They've stopped it, and the country is now under the harshest sanctions it's ever faced, and people are struggling to find basic goods because the West is trying to prevent Syria from winning the peace. Then you have Venezuela. It stopped a ruthless coup attempt that every reporter in U.S. media and everyone in Washington thought it was going to be over in a few days, and that Juan Guaido was going to ride his motorcycle like Prince into Miraflores Palace, and it didn't happen. It's really over, and now Venezuela is facing not just sanctions, but secondary sanctions. And Iran is facing secondary sanctions. What are secondary sanctions? That means that companies in Europe or the US that want to do business with the Venezuelan government, with Iran, with the Iranian military, the whole military is now under sanctions, they face sanctions as well. And you have a rising China, which is supplying aid to Venezuela, in the form of medical aid, basic medical aid, which is being denied to people in Venezuela by sanctions. And China is now facing another form of sanctions through the ban on Huawei technology and massive trade war. And Russia itself is facing sanctions. Russia has sent about 100 trainers to Venezuela to help them use the military technology that they were sold, especially anti-aircraft weapons, to deter a possible U.S. military intervention. And I think it's a big factor in why the military hasn't intervened. So what's happening in that part of the world? What's happening in Turkey, for example, a country that assisted in the destruction of Syria, helped the U.S., hosted a U.S. airbase from which all of the weapons were delivered to the so-called moderate rebels. Turkey's now facing sanctions from the U.S. because it wants to buy Russian weapons, because wants to do trade with Venezuela. India, a country run by a pro-U.S. right-wing president, Narendra Modi, who was just re-elected, is facing sanctions because it wants to trade with Venezuela. What's going to happen there? I think we're going to see these other countries start to develop a system of trade that circumvents the dominance of the US dollar. I think we're going to see them have to develop their own technology to circumvent the fact that right now for cell phones, you have two kinds of chips, iOS for Apple and Android. And in Russia, they're developing Aurora technology, which is just starting to go into testing mode. They are developing their own online internet systems to circumvent the fact that the U.S. in many ways controls the internet. And when you see suppression online, when you see, for example, Twitter taking down the verification of Nicolas Maduro the day after the coup begins and naming Juan Guaido interim president, or you see Wikipedia naming Juan Guaido interim president, it's not as if this is happening organically. It really shows that the giants of Silicon Valley are operating under the thumb of the U.S. national security state. And so other countries, rising powers, are seeing that. They're seeing that they can't depend on Silicon Valley. They can't operate with blind faith towards even U.S. companies. And so they're developing their own. And we're moving, I think, into a new phase of empire where the dominance of the U.S. will be countered in a non-military way. We are ourselves in a kind of war here. We're in an information war, where news is no longer honest. Fake news is actually being promulgated by corporate media much more than the alternative media sites that are being targeted for suppression. And we need to see it that way, but we also need to know that the facts are on our side, that you can be the best educators, and you already are, and that you have a whole generation that wants to actually live in peace, that doesn't want to be in permanent war, and their ears are open to you. So when you go out of this room, you have to really operate under that mentality and be in solidarity with the people in all of these other nations who, as Anya always says, have a lot more in common with us than our leaders do. And so I guess with that, I will end it. I do have a question that's not for myself, but it would be a question for Anya because she was in the Venezuelan embassy for, I think, 12 days under siege by right-wing Venezuelans. My question before we go to Q&A would be if you could describe your experience for 5 minutes to the room. And tell them about what... And you can talk about what's happening in September. Just do 5 minutes.
With permission.
Yes.
Well, many of you heard me speak about this last night, but I want to make sure that people who weren't there have an understanding of what I think we should take away from my experience and the rest of my comrades who are in the embassy, the experience. I was embedded media there. I was one of the last 7 people in the embassy. There were 4 who agreed at the end to stay and get arrested. Adrian Pine, David Paul, Margaret Flowers, and Kevin Zeese, real heroes. They're going to court tomorrow. Tomorrow will be their second day in court. They're facing a year in prison, a potential $100,000 fine. We thought perhaps we expected the charge would be trespassing, but the federal government charged them with interfering with U.S. officials trying to engage in protective activities of the embassy, which is a federal Class A misdemeanor in an attempt to make life more difficult for them. So, fingers crossed, I hope everybody here follows that case, and that I'm sure they're going to be asking for funds to raise money for their legal fund. And what I said last night is what happened to us in that embassy is a microcosm, and it's a case study in how the U.S. empire operates abroad and how it treats Venezuela. Because just as with the Cuban people and with the Venezuelan people, the U.S. can't achieve its objectives through pressuring the will of the people in those countries the way they wanted to pressure our will and force us out of the embassy through intimidation. They had to turn to other tactics. So what was the first thing they did to us? On the day of the failed coup, when Carlos Vecchio, Guaido's shadow puppet ambassador, Mike Pompeo's shadow puppet ambassador, couldn't come into the embassy, and he was shouted down by people from the windows who shut him up as he tried to have a press conference outside. They surrounded the building in order to cut off any food or water from coming in an attempt to starve us out. And that's completely analogous to the way they cut off intense what they were doing, and they were violent with people on the outside, our allies. There's video of them choking people, for example, sexually assaulting people. I mean, really nasty things. Just like on Venezuela's border, we see the funding of right-wing militias, right? I mean, it's more intense, but it's the same idea. They put pressure on you from the outside in order to intimidate you or give this feeling that at any point in Venezuela they could invade. That's what they're doing in Colombia, right? That's what they wanted to do on February 23rd when they failed. And then the last thing they did was cut off our electricity. The U.S. wants to deny that it had any hand, and we're conspiracy theorists if we even suggest that the blackout was planned or premeditated and that Washington had a role. But as Max said, this was something they were discussing openly within the opposition and within U.S. Consultant groups that were saying, how could we best bring the opposition to power, cut off the electricity? And that's exactly what they did to us, U.S. citizens on the inside of the embassy. So that tells me those are the tactics of U.S. empire when they don't get what they want. And they can't get what they want because, as Max laid out, we've seen this slow progression of a failure in U.S. regime change operations. You know, it was such a disaster in Iraq and Libya. It didn't work in Syria, and it maybe, inshallah, won't even get to that stage in Venezuela, though we have to acknowledge that there is a war already being waged on Venezuela. The economic war can't be downplayed. We can't forget about it. That is war, enough on its own. And then there's the media war and a diplomatic war, too, which we saw take place at the embassy, take place at the OAS, through the removal of, not the real removal because Venezuela was already leaving, but the recognition of these fake coup officials representing Venezuela at the Organization for American States. These are the fronts in the war where the United States can win, economically, in the media, and in some of these institutions where the United States wields disproportionate power. So we have to keep this conversation alive and keep these events and protests, things like Univision, and here in Miami you guys can do a lot or in the greater Miami area, just like we in Washington will try to keep up this energy. And then most importantly, on September 21st, the organizers who came out of the Embassy Protection Collective, we were thinking, what can we do? How can we seize on this moment, this renewed energy around the anti-war movement in the United States to bring a massive movement to the forefront once again? You know, I remember the Iraq War demonstrations where we had millions of people all around the country protesting a potential invasion of Iraq. And we thought that we could use the internationally recognized Day of Peace, which is September 21st, happens to coincide exactly with when the UN General Assembly will be taking place in New York City. So leaders from all around the world will be present in New York. We're calling for U.S. citizens from all around the country to go to New York on September 21st and say that we believe in international law, we believe in dialogue, we believe in peace, and the U.S. public, the people, reject the illegal actions of our elites in the government who don't represent us. Max already stole my line. You know what I'm going to say. We have more in common with the people they're trying to attack than we do with these people in our government, and it's time that the U.S. public makes that statement loud and clear for the rest of the world to hear. I think if enough of us turn out in New York, they won't be able to ignore us. Even in the mainstream U.S. media, it has the potential to be a really important moment, so I hope that as many of you as possible can come to that, but also that you just keep it up. I'm so glad that I see some of the same faces here tonight that I did last night, and that there's just so much passion and interest in what's going on now, because we can't forget about it. We can't act as though these wars aren't happening just because they're not as conventional as the Iraq War or other wars like Afghanistan that we're used to. It's happening. People are suffering. People are dying. I could go on and on. I mean, I would say also check out this petition I tweeted out today calling on a Portuguese bank to release Venezuelan funds, because what's really horrific, something that's been happening with this bank, Nova Banco, it has been accepting payments through Citgo and PDVSA for cancer patients, Venezuelan cancer patients who can't receive bone marrow transplants in Venezuela. They've had a program with the Italian government where they're sending their patients to Italy in order to get bone marrow transplants and treatment. And this Portuguese bank has stopped allowing the Maduro government to access its funds and make these payments. And so 2 children have already died in the past 2 weeks. That's just one example of the cost of sanctions and things that we should be telling people. The war is happening and we have to resist it.
We have been privileged to hear a fantastic group of people. We have time for questions. Darian?
Just one really quick statement.
Yeah.
I want to give a shout out to my friend Tomanisha Brown, who we wrote together the speech that I prepared, and she wasn't able to be here. She was actually going to deliver at least part of the speech, but she had to go help her aunt with something or like drop off her car. I wish she had been here. I'm really glad for the help writing it, and yeah, I just wanted to shout her out.
Okay. Very nice.
Now a question for Max. I wanted to kind of get a reflection on the differences between maybe what you expected when you went to Venezuela or the U.S. mainstream media, the differences between mainstream media here and the kind of outlooks that people had there. If you could just speak to that.
I'll stand, I guess, because I got to be in the way of that shotgun. Great question. Even when you go into a place you haven't been before with the mentality that I have, which I assume is similar to yours, where you're totally skeptical of everything you've heard, there's no way that you can't sort of brace yourself and prepare yourself for to expect that it will be somewhat dystopian. What we were told about Venezuela was that they were facing one of the worst. Beto O'Rourke today called it the worst humanitarian crisis ever in the Western Hemisphere, like ever. One of the worst. Okay. one of the worst. It's one of the most concrete things he's actually said. He usually says nothing. It's like, we need to move forward for the better future of tomorrow, for the children who will be born. Then,
Stand on something.
yeah, stand on something. Yeah, I'll jump on the table, skateboard off it, and play my guitar.
I was in a punk band.
Yeah. So, I thought that I would see something that would shock me, and I prepared for it. And, I'm like, I'm not going to ascribe blame, but I'm going to see the situation for what it is. And it just wasn't like that at all. The first place we stayed was Candelaria, which is downtown, and it's a traditionally poor area. There are many chavistas there, and you don't see what you see in downtown Washington, D.C., where you see all this development, and then you see block after block of homeless people and just desperation in the street, people eating in the trash. You don't see that. I was going into restaurants, and there were a lot of people in the restaurants eating arepas or whatever. I would go to markets, and they were having markets that were like below market rate for the poorest people in places like Parroquia Macarao, which is like a very poor barrio outside of Caracas, and the city was subsidizing it, and volunteers would come out from the community to provide the food and the sanitary supplies. And then you have the CLAP program, which of course is now a target for U.S. sanctions, and that is essentially a free food program where people get boxes or bags of the food they need for the 2 weeks along with sanitary supplies. And the U.S. wants to target that. It really makes it very well known that it wants to starve people on a massive level that feeds millions of Venezuelans. But you also saw in the wealthier areas where I wound up staying. I mentioned Altamira earlier, where this black Venezuelan had been burned in the streets by supporters of Leopoldo Lopez. And I stayed a few blocks from there in that area. There was pro-Lopez graffiti on the walls. There were like luxury shops everywhere that people were shopping in. Women walking down the street with their yoga mats, and people were out doing their thing. And I did some videos, which you all can see or have seen, from a supermarket in that area, countering the U.S. media propaganda, which is stating in no uncertain terms that Venezuelans are unable to procure toothpaste and toothbrushes. And I went in there and found like everything I could have possibly found in a U.S. supermarket, including toilet paper infused with aloe vera and chamomile. And there are a lot of choices. I used it all. It was so refreshing. I wish.
Also, they have bidets in Venezuela. That's a
They have bidets in Cuba. That was what shocked me about Cuba. I was like, why don't we have bidets? Like, there's no special period in the U.S. But okay, so it was just that the level of disinformation from U.S. corporate media was so extreme that it enabled me to make those videos and to actually make them funny, because there was a real economic crisis, and Nicolas Maduro even acknowledged some mistakes that his administration made, which helped lead to that crisis, in his inaugural address after surviving an assassination attempt. And so it isn't like they're pretending that they've done everything exactly right, but the sanctions, which are much more extreme now than they were when I was there, have just, the whole point of them is to prevent them from getting out of the inflation and to make sure that hyperinflation metastasizes and completely destroys the economy. That's the point of it. But the main thing that I would say that I saw that just shook me up the most is what a functional, normal-seeming society it was. And on February 23rd, I was looking at pictures of an air base near where I was staying in where the coup actually would take place on April 30th. And there were people surrounding it, and I'm like, oh my God, it's happening. It's going to be huge. Like, they're actually taking over an air base, and they're going to like force all the soldiers to defect. And so we ran down there. I went down with my Gray Zone colleagues, including Anya, and what we saw was like a picnic. It was pathetic. And it basically ended within an hour of us getting there, and everyone went home, and they literally went to lunch to get Chinese food in the neighborhood. And then the whole thing was over. But if you watched U.S. media or you looked at the Twitter accounts of the opposition, it looked like a war was taking place. So yeah, that's why I say we're in an information war, and it's our job, if we can't get there, as I was able to do, to find other ways to see through it and to question all of these humanitarian ploys. I think you were about to raise your hand.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to.
I wanted to ask, so I think like pretty much every speaker kind of talked about the fact that, you know, not just the US, but imperial powers like across the world have sort of gone on this trend of being more militant about their approach to destabilizing regimes that they disagree with. Do you think that countering that narrative lies in movements that are left-leaning in our country and other countries as well becoming more militant? Or do you think that we should sort of rely on already established institutions to like counter the U.S. like hegemony? I'm referring specifically to like the International Criminal Court. They don't prosecute the U.S., but do you think that putting pressure on countries that have more say, like China, to, you know, basically push them to prosecute the U.S. would be helpful as well?
That's a great question, and I can only speak as a journalist because I control one institution which has like a URL, and that's pretty much all I'm able to do. I created it for that purpose. You know, militancy, that's not a word I associate with the gray zone, but I know what you're saying, but I created it because there's such a void, and that when you talk about media institutions in the U.S., you know, Democracy Now!, that's the largest, most well-known progressive media institution, which has in the past been very progressive on foreign policy and criticizing the U.S., and they've gone a different way. I talked about it last night, and they've been very disappointing when it comes to regime change, often supporting the State Department line. Then you have Jacobin. I mean, there's some good stuff in there, but they have really disappointed me deeply in the way that they...
What are some concrete examples? Because I watched Democracy read Jacobin. I don't agree with everything, but I think the vast majority of what I see I do agree with. So I'm curious, you have almost an extreme opposite point of view that you articulated about those entities.
Well, if you opposed regime change in Syria, then you would have known what the White Helmets were and why they existed, which is to stimulate Western support.
So the Syrian government was quite promoted neoliberalism before any of this happened? And
well, you're getting into an argument, but I'm giving you a concrete example, and I said if. It sounds like you supported regime change there.
No, I didn't. I
Okay.
do not. But see, that's the conflation that you're making. And
I'm not making a conflation.
I agree with 90%
So
of what
I'm giving a...
like,
anyway.
give me a chance to speak, please. I agree.
But I'm trying to answer his question, and then we'll go to your question.
All right.
So in media, and you know, there are people who think that
Well, me personally, I think that this is me speaking as myself, you know. I think that the Bolivarian Revolution has such a potency to be a center of gravity for. I feel it's so strong, and that we can probably chop it up on the theoretical side, but I think that you can. I think principal struggle means that you have to go into the politics at hand, and everybody in Miami knows what Venezuela is. They know the bad stuff, right? But you can talk to them on that level. And so that's why I wear this shirt at FIU, and I'll talk with anyone about it, because I believe that our ideas and the history and the legacy of Latin America lives here too.
There are more of us
Yeah, there's more.
than there are.
Yeah. I mean, it's a question of how also like, you know, creating new institutions allows you to mobilize people that couldn't be, that felt left out, you know, that had nowhere else to go. And so you're doing that here with this organization you have in this coalition. It's really inspiring to come down here and see the work that you guys are doing. And I really think, you know, national gatherings like the one on September 21st will allow us all to kind of come together and meet each other. So we need to build towards that.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the conversation. I just wanted to make a fundamental point. To critique the government of Syria is not to call for regime change. In fact, I think that's the conflation I was pointing to. Because Jacobin, I've never seen anything in Jacobin or Democracy Now! That supports regime change. They do not take the State Department line. What they do have is they have people that have just different opinions on the class structure of regimes like Syria. But that is not an equation to calling for that regime to be overthrown. Certainly not by the United States, not by imperialist countries. But there is a difference between making a left critique of U.S. intervention and actually appreciating the fact that there are class structures and power structures in other countries that are also problematic, that deserve their own critique. And the Syrian government, the Syrian ruling class deserve our critique. The solution to that ruling class and that regime is not U.S. intervention. It's not regime change from the outside, but that doesn't deny the fact that there's still a class structure inside Syria. Assad's not, is not a good person. There's a class structure there.
Let's keep it to, I hear what you're saying, but
there's a class structure there, and to suggest
I get the point. I want to hear your question.
to suggest that Democracy Now! And Jacobin are somehow enemies of the gray zone is ridiculous. They're on our side.
Can I respond to that, maybe?
Yeah, you can, but we should keep.
I'd just like to briefly.
Wait a minute.
I feel like I agree completely that you can make left critiques of various governments, of even leftist governments. Not to say that Assad's is a leftist government.
No, it's the opposite.
Absolutely. But I think that the timing of those arguments is critical, because if it comes at a time when those states are under threat, then it emboldens imperial power.
Especially if it's coming from progressive left-wing.
Yeah.
It's none of our, shut up, just don't say anything.
I think that there has to be a timing to these things, and you can consider internal elements, but we have to, I think we should also be mindful of the role that's going to play in imperial involvement. And like Max said, the headway that gives reactionary elements, Al-Qaeda, ISIS.
Well, I agree with you up to a point.
We have Max here.
The hands off.
You are here. Let's go to questions to Max.
Or the others.
Or the other speakers.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Max, what's your opinion on China's presence in South America? Because, I find it, I know that most Cubans on the island would just love to be what Washington, D.C. is currently describing, the superpower epic Havana that's controlling the Maduro regime. Pretty sure some Cubans would take some national pride in that, but obviously that's not the case. It's still a very poor country, and it's very limited in terms of actual power to change government or let alone control them. So I'm just curious how China is not being denounced at least at the same level of Havana, because China basically is doing so much business with Chile, for example. China has really just put its little foot in the region. So how come the United States, the current administration at least, is not publicly denouncing that? How do you see it?
I think if you look at the wider region, the Trump administration's getting very, very heated about Belt and Road Initiative. Mike Pence has given several speeches where he's actually, directly addressed not just Latin America, but Africa. And John Bolton gave a big speech on Africa, and the whole speech was about convincing African countries not to go with China and Belt and Road and to go with the U.S. They're very threatened by China's development model, and they warn about the debt trap. Those are the two words you constantly hear in U.S. media when it comes to Belt and Road and China's investment in Latin America and Africa. The trade war is a symptom of that. When you talk about Cuba and Venezuela, I think that when they constantly talk about, Cuba controlling Venezuela, It's first of all a rhetorical device to push back against the real fact that the U.S. would like to control it and intervene, and it's become this annoying talking point of the opposition in the same way that the Syrian opposition would say, what about Russian imperialism, when Russia was invited into Syria by the actual government. And in Venezuela, you have a long-standing relationship with Cuba, and now you're seeing it reach a really farcical degree where Nick Casey, you know Nick Casey at the New York Times, he's someone you should know as the Judith Miller of today. His job at the New York Times is to promote U.S. intervention in Venezuela, and he's the chief correspondent for the New York Times in that region, and he did a story claiming that Cuban doctors are coming to Venezuela to force people to vote for Maduro, and that they refuse to provide medical care to them unless they vote for Maduro. And so the demonization is definitely there. This is a talking point, but I think it's also a talking point for domestic purposes. It's for Florida 2020, and it's to try to connect the whole thing. But what do you think? I mean, you seem to think that Cuba is being demonized in a way that it hadn't been before, and that China has more of an influence. And what do you think of what China's doing vis-a-vis Cuba, for example?
What, in terms of, basically, you're just throwing the same question to me back? Right. I just think that, yes, I totally agree that they're definitely trying to maintain Florida, keep it Republican, which will not work for too long because Shalala one, the district that they thought was just going to go from Ileana Rodlending to, so obviously Florida's demographic, it's Cuban demographic that has obviously just licked some Republican boot, even though obviously most Cubans here do not live up to the standards of Republican high middle class. But yeah, Florida right now would be one of those things that they want to keep in their little new crusade against socialism. Linking AOC to Fidel Castro and Kim Jong Un. Wow, wow, we're reaching some really scary totalitarian heights. But I think that China definitely is something that should start worrying the U.S., and they are. I just think that since Cuba is not at the level of China, it's so much easier to just keep the story with, Cuba, but obviously Cuba's not the level of China's strength.
Yes. Peter and Robert.
I wanted to ask you, y'all had talked about the hardship that Cuba went through after the dissolution of the USSR, and I was wondering if any of Venezuela's allies are suffering a lot because of the removal of their kind of sponsorship and solidarity via sanctions and so on.
Cuba's rationing, right?
Well,
is that?
Yes. Certain food staples have begun to be rationed.
And you want to talk about that?
Yeah, there's a couple. I mean, there's like some resources online that a friend pointed me to that show like just the effect. Venezuela subsidizes a lot of like the economies in the Caribbean specifically. So I think Tam had mentioned how like even Guyana's like suffering a lot because they used to subsidize petroleum for them. So yeah, it's like it obviously has lateral effects. I mean, when they sanctioned and when they embargoed Cuba, pretty much all we had was sugarcane. So it's not like people were going to really lose out a lot. But Venezuela is like the biggest, has the biggest oil reserve on the planet. So people are going to suffer.
I remember like Haiti had big Petrocaribe projects there, and so I'm afraid that countries that are that poor, I mean, just like you were talking about Libya, this giant intervention happens right to the north of places like Niger and stuff in the Sahel that are going through this crazy drought.
Right.
Just wonder if, countries like Haiti are suffering a lot because of the sanctions on them.
You can look at what's happening now, but there's also the Petrocaribe scandal, where the government the U.S. wants in there has basically squandered the money. So it's also a corruption scandal as well, and you don't hear about it as a lot. And in Honduras today, there's a massive general strike. A massive general strike. I mean, so many people are in the streets because that government, which won through electoral fraud, you'll never hear it called authoritarian on NPR. That government...
Even the OAS said the election.
Yeah. That government is trying to privatize the public education and health sector and lay off medical workers and teachers in a giant austerity plan, and they're resisting it. And this would be covered, the thing that these people need to do to get coverage is to get Venezuelan citizenship. That's the only way the U.S. media is going to pay attention when Honduras is under the control of the government it backs. But yeah, I mean, everyone in this room can tell you about ways other countries in the region are suffering because Venezuela was such a central node of the progressive wave in Latin America. And by the way, we should pay attention to what's happening in Argentina because, you know, Cristina Kirchner is popular. The government in power has been doing the same thing that the Honduran government is doing, just laying off people. It's doing a horrible job. It's extremely unpopular. And there's now an effort to basically prosecute Kirchner. And this is like the new thing that was done to Lula and to Dilma. It's a new form of coup. It's the legal coup. And then there's the parliamentary coup. In Korea. Why is he in Belgium?
In Paraguay
Well,
too.
So,
Okay, Peter and Robert, is anybody else? Lead again, Chip, let Chip go.
So we've heard a lot in this discussion about the power of the dollar and how the Yankees penetrate all these countries, they close markets, they cause countries to suffer because that's the power of the dollar and the cruelty of that, which is what they have to offer the world. Is more economic suffering, more threats of war. That's their answer to the problems of humanity. But I think it's very interesting when you think about Cuba, which doesn't have a lot of economic defenses against that. How do they fight back? How do they choose to fight back? They fight back with internationalism. The U.S. sort of projecting its own evil says the Cubans are sending troops, the Cubans are sending spies to repress the people there, doctors to bribe the people there. But Cuba is sending tens of thousands of doctors to parts of this country where people couldn't get medical aid before. They're sending teachers. They're sending, they have some specialists and other things. But the brunt of what they're saying is that the way Cuba fights back is to empower the masses of people to be able to fight better for the goals, and that's right in the Constitution of Cuba. The first article in the Constitution of Cuba is this interests of the Cuban Revolution are subordinate to the interests of the world revolution. They weaken their own national defense to send people to Africa to fight the South Africans. So I think that's very important that the confidence that the masses of people, however much we have screwed up leaderships, we're fighting to. It's our mass struggle and our class struggle that's going to be the road forward for us. And it's only within that class struggle that the people in a particular struggle in a particular country can find the ways to make the struggle stronger. So I'm saying this because one part of our Hands Off Venezuela coalition, which we had a lot of discussion on, and it was not an easy discussion, was what do we say about Venezuela, for example? What we say is U.S. hands off Venezuela. We don't say, we don't have an opinion about Maduro. Not that each individual person doesn't. Any political person will. But we think that it's most important that the people of Venezuela themselves have the political space and time, free from the pressure of our government, the intervention of our government, to straighten. Two, I think, of mostly led by teachers. These were, in many cases, illegal strikes that were carried out and won victories, and won them on the basis of reaching out to the Black community, Chicano community in California, and so forth. We have to hook up with that. We have to be on the lookout for that. I think the idea of a national march in New York is a good idea, because we can use it just like we use Max's tour to reach out to new people we can offer very attractive action, you know. We've had this teach-outs, but we also need to put our words into action. So I just wanted to throw that in because we hear a lot about how powerful the U.S. is, how evil it is, but it has limits when it runs up against the class struggle. You know, Max talked about what happened in Afghanistan and how they cultivated Bin Laden, right, was the second richest family in Saudi Arabia. He went over there and the U.S. was paying his way there. That's how he got his start. But also in those years, in '79 was the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Grenadian Revolution, Burkina Faso. There were a lot of things going on that were class struggle things, and that also affected what the U.S. policy could do and put some limits on what it could do. And that's the part we have to emphasize and duplicate. In that.
Great commentary, but let's strike out since we are not going to have Max here for a while. Let's make our questions to Max so we can then.
It's a discussion. It's a discussion.
I just wanted to
Whatever you all want to do.
chime in on.
Wait, Robert. Question, sir.
Yeah, Max, you mentioned Europe earlier and the rise of right-wing political parties there. I'm wondering, is this being based on certain element of xenophobia and due to the refugee situation there in Europe? We all know that the refugee situation in Europe, at the core of it, we have the advance of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. But apparently, the reaction of the voting public in Europe is xenophobic, and it supports these right-wing groups that exploit it. Do you think there's any way that the voting public in Europe might have an epiphany where they see the more fundamental basis of the refugee problem that they're facing and come to terms with the fact that they bear a degree of responsibility due to their at least acquiescence to U.S. imperialism?
Yeah, I mean, I write in my book a lot about that question, and there's a lot to say about it. I'll try to be brief as possible. I think one of the reasons that the far right is rising in Europe is because they have, I mean, you have a party itself called the Alternative for Deutschland, and that's doing extremely well in Angela Merkel's Germany because they've presented themselves effectively as the only alternative to the system of the center right and the center left and the system of the EU, which has basically driven people into gradually a lower standard of living when they've been accustomed to kind of this social democratic system that from the cradle to the grave has basically given them the highest standard of living in the world. This is particularly true in Western Europe. And then you have on the center right politicians like David Cameron, and on the center left in the UK, a politician like Joe Cox, who was murdered by a far right extremist in what I consider the opening shot of Brexit by a killer, a neo-Nazi named Thomas Mayer, who declared England first as he stabbed Joe Cox. Who is Joe Cox? She was from a very affluent and very liberal district who was the key advocate for Syrian intervention and was issuing a report actually as counter to the Chilcot report. It was supposed to be released on the day of the Chilcot report, and the Chilcot report was the British parliamentary inquiry into all of the scum who took them to the Iraq War and all the mistakes they made, especially Tony Blair. And her report was to be about how Syria was not Iraq, and that we still needed to do this to save the children of Syria. And at the same time, Joe Cox was the leading advocate for accepting refugees from Syria into the UK. And I would say she's very courageous for doing that. But at the same time, there's a hypocrisy there. Same hypocrisy you see from Hillary Clinton, who wants to intervene militarily everywhere, and then says, at least, that she's pro-immigrant. And people see that, specifically people who are not in the cosmopolitan center where the economy's doing well, who are losing their pensions, and who are suspicious of people who are different than them. And they reflexively support the far right of Nigel Farage or the AfD or whatever far right parties. Marine Le Pen, she speaks the same narrative. And when you look at what Le Pen has to say about intervening militarily, she is the figure who's the most against it. And then you have people who I think present a left-wing alternative. Jeremy Corbyn, Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, who's a really, I think, has great things to say about the future his country needs. And they face so much internal opposition from the center left. It's almost like liberals hate people on the left more than they hate the right. And that's what you see with Jeremy Corbyn and the campaign against him from within UK Labour. You have like Chuka Amuna and these people who formed this new party out of Labour who've openly said that they would rather see Labour under Jeremy Corbyn lose than Jeremy Corbyn win. And it's the same thing in France with a lot of center-left politicians. And so it's very hard for the left to present an alternative in the European system right now. And the far right, meanwhile, is just like running away with it on issues like Brexit. The Brexit party, like, do people actually really support their program? No, but their base totally just supports Brexit. And they want a clean break with the EU. They don't want a soft Brexit. And so that's why they have succeeded in the EU parliamentary elections. So what happens is once the far right gets into power, once they actually have to govern, I think you're going to have to see a real left alternative. And you're going to see them not provide all the things they've been promising people. They'll show that they're really just as much on the side of big business as the centrist neoliberal parties, and they'll start to fall. But right now, they are what's seen by many people who've been left behind in Europe as the true alternative. And the refugee crisis has just exacerbated and accelerated that trend. And one final point is that anti-Semitism in Europe, which we constantly hear about, is actually Islamophobia now. The Muslim in Europe is the Jew of World War II. And a lot of those parties that disappeared after World War II went dormant. And there were some figures actually who in the 1970s who actually had roots in Nazism wrote about how as Muslim immigration comes to Europe, we can begin to rise again by turning the Muslim into the Jewish scapegoat. And that's precisely what they're doing. And so, interestingly and amazingly, you have these far-right parties like the Alternative for Deutschland, like the Austrian Freedom Party, which have grown out of the dormant Nazi cells of World War II, that are the most pro-Israel parties in Europe. Because Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli right speaks the same rhetoric. They have absorbed historical anti-Semitism and projected it outwards against Palestinians, against Arabs, and against Muslims, and they formed this kind of fascist axis. So these parties are also able to capitalize on the fact that they're no longer pariahs for hating Jews because they've transferred that onto Muslims, and they can say, we love the Jews. The Jews are our biggest friend. I just met with Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, and we made plans to bomb the West Bank, to celebrate the bombing of the West Bank. So that's a very dangerous phenomenon. And then the axis extends through Brazil and goes into the Popular Will Party. And, I met a lot of people outside the embassy who didn't just hate me because of my work on Venezuela and what I said on Venezuela, but hated me because of my support for Palestine. And actually confronted me about that, and these were Venezuelans who also happened to be right-wing Zionists. So there's so much, there's basically...
International fascist.
Yeah, there's a fascist international. Yeah, there's a fascist international now, and what's that book by John Anderson? Do you know?
John Lee Anderson, the Che guy.
I'll think of it in a second. the World Anti-Communist League. Do you know what that is?
Heroes.
Learn about the World Anti-Communist League, because that was basically the right-wing alternative to the Socialist International, and it's being revived now. And I really feel like the people that we're facing most directly as our most direct enemies are the new World Anti-Communist League, and no one else is challenging them.
No, don't sit down. We get it's getting late. We have 3 more people that have raised their hands.
Okay, I'll be really quick.
And I think he has host privileges. You want to ask him? You want to say something?
No. I was gonna add on to something he said, but it's been too long. It's fine.
Okay. Chip,
I'm gonna save my question for tomorrow night.
for tomorrow night. Okay. Well, that's a good segue to later.
Right, so I want to add to what Pete was saying, and just like you said, apparently Pete's statement provoked a lot of opinions, but it's also linked to something that Max can answer, because it is true. I mean, if any of you are not part of the Hands of Venezuela, for sure join, because like, I don't know, maybe we're gonna get a little vain and cocky about it, but we did fight against the whole coup and everything, and it failed. You know, obviously it was because of many things, but it failed, did it not? And if anybody has ever admired the generation that stood up on campuses everywhere and said, we do not support the war in Vietnam, you know, those people are like basic heroes now that we look up to them, because they were right when everybody was, you know, wrong. So, yeah, this is basically a chance. I'd say this is a chance to be anti-war, be pro-peace, and be the modern hippie, right? But anyways, with Max, like, I want to know, like, if you have an opinion as to what could come next. The coup failed. Since you know, like, what they've done in Libya and all these other countries, do you have any idea that, like, can you guess their style of attack? What would come next?
Well, first I want to say that, you know, people in Venezuela have paid really close attention to what you all are doing, like really close, and they know who you are, and they're like in awe. I mean, they really consider you to be heroes.
That's true.
And you know,
Really don't wait?
Yeah, no, you guys even, I saw them promoting part of the event last
and
night.
you know, all of the different kind of regime change, like we like to do at the Gray Zone, is like hit the lie of the day or hit the lie of the month, and it's always relating to regime change, and we've never felt this much energy around anything. So I think this is just such an impressive display for the past few months, and so I hope there's something that we can do to capitalize on the energy. I think that there are very few options for the regime change machine. You know, they have the embassy, and that's basically Carlos Vecchio and his little crew in Washington. They had an office downtown that was their little lobbying shop, and they're just turning the embassy into a lobbying shop for war. A coup plotting center, and they've called on Southcom, which is, you know, down here, for military assistance. How'd that go down? It didn't.
They stood him up for a meeting.
They stood up Carlos Vecchio for a meeting. The generals aren't really too excited about this. Those are your constituents too that are going to be starving, and they have to have that on their hands and on their legacy, be in favor of mass starvation. So there has to be some kind of mediation. Today, once again, contradicted his national security team and said that he likes to see the dialogue that's taking place, whereas the State Department has said they support no dialogue except the negotiation of regime change. So I don't think they have a plan. I actually don't think they have a plan. One thing I mentioned last night is that there was a guy who threatened to slaughter the Code Pink embassy protectors, who's a former U.S. Marine who works down here in South Florida, and he's been part of an effort to call for a free Venezuelan army. And I don't know if they want to arm psychopaths like that, but I don't think that's going to happen right now. And so you have a clash of the mandarins. Figures in the Trump administration are basically fighting about what to do next, with Bolton wanting to do probably the most extreme thing and Trump having absolutely no desire for a war. And beyond Florida, you have Trump's MAGA hat wearing white people constituency. A lot of them served in Iraq or knew people who served in Iraq, and I don't think they want a war. I don't think they want to fight to the last American for Juan Guaido. So the question to ask now, and you know, in Florida, in a swing state, you're going to get the candidates coming down here, Bernie or whoever, Pete Buttigieg or Buddy Gig, you know, Beto O'Rourke's going to jump up on a table at your school. Grill them about the sanctions, because the sanctions are there and they will stay there unless even a Democratic administration feels massive pressure to end them. And that's what you should be getting in their faces about sanctions and just hounding them, because sanctions is war. And so, I mean, the war will continue in the form of sanctions, even though I don't know what result it will have. And I mean, I don't see the government going anywhere. So this is a stalemate.
And there will be elections next year for the National Assembly, which means Juan Guaido's leadership in the National Assembly will be over.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think we all have been privileged, at least I feel this way, of seeing Max, Yadira, and Ania speak to, and Daniel speak to us tonight. It has been a great experience. Max Tours continues tomorrow, and it's gonna be at the Coral Gable Congregational Church. Peter, what's the address of the church?
Hold on. I'm not a church
3010 DeSoto Boulevard.
3010 DeSoto Road.
Boulevard.
I know as a cube.
DeSoto Boulevard.
Yeah.
He's mixing it up every night.
Right.
Trying to keep it
And
new and fresh.
The other thing is, we have the list of your email addresses. Hope we can understand it. And we put you on a list. Some of you already on the list, and the rest, you know that we already communicating with you. We're gonna be communicating with you. We have meetings periodically. In those meetings, sometimes we have very good discussions, like the one that we might have had tonight if we have had the time to be able to do that. So hopefully we will see each other again. Not just from a speaker to audience, but in terms of preparing things. For him to come here, and for Anya to come here, it took a lot of work. By the way, I want to thank Brother Peter for the tremendous job. This deal.
And him and Nancy have been wonderful, wonderful hosts.
Him and who?
Nancy have been wonderful hosts.
Yeah,
they're taking very good care of
us. So, tomorrow night, I don't know. I am more eager now to go tomorrow night than I was yesterday. Because I really believe that what the brother here has laid out is totally together. And the more time you have the opportunity of listening to totally together explanations, is the best there is for all of us. You know. So thank you very much. Thank you to Daniel and the YDSA for the great job, Andy, and all the other people in the YDSA. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow night.
Makes sense.
Gracias.